What is up, Internet? So, today, let's talk Boise, Idaho. I'm going to do a long form video. I'm going to tell you what I'm seeing in this local economy as it relates to the population, labor market, and how that could ultimately impact something like housing. And I'll just go ahead and tell you right up front there's no housing shortage here, as there really isn't across the country. If somebody says that, understand that person probably doesn't even know what they mean by that. Are they saying like there's a shortage of listings for sale, or are they talking about a structural shortage? Well, the more material of those two is going to be the structural piece, because listings for sale at a given time may represent, I don't know, a few percent of all homes in a given market. It's really stupid. So, okay, what we're looking at here is the population data, really just shown two ways: by age and then like race, really. Okay. So the color scheme, all the ones, blue, green, gray, and those various shadings, it's all by age, right? So for the Boise metro, there is like 840 some odd thousand people in the area, shown as a stacked bar chart by 5 year age groups. And I basically lumped that information into three big buckets to line up with kind of government statistics. Under 25 is that blue shading. 25 to 54, that's your prime working age. That's the green shading. 55 plus is the gray shading. Think of that as sort of like your silver tsunami, so to speak. So again, a line doesn't really tell you much. If you can see the composition of the population, it's much more meaningful. So yeah, it's getting older. But okay, this is that same thing year over year, just scaled differently. And now, if I go over here and I cut that same information, right, the population as a whole, just by like race, it's going to add up to that. I'm making no distinction for age. So white, Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander, Hispanic or Latino, Black, African American, Asian, uh, American Indian, Alaska Native, two plus races. All these other ones are single race. So really, the driver here is Hispanic or Latino, right? See how it's grabbing more share. You can see it over here year over year. Remember, all of this information is annual. It's through 2024. It comes from the census. Uh, Now, if we can look at this information, write the iterations of that, and see what it looks like. So, Hispanic or Latino by age, right? That would be down here. White by age, share year over year. Black. But by the way, that's why the background is different for. So this is white, white, Asian, Asian, Black, Black, Hispanic or Latino, Hispanic or Latino. I mean, the most material thing outside of white is clearly this bucket, and these uh, yellow dotted lines are just a national benchmark. So in other words, the gray piece would come all the way down to this dotted yellow line. This is indicating to me that yes, the population of white individuals is getting older, but it's still younger than the national trend. Same thing for Asians, Black, Hispanic, or Latino. I mean, and this only kind of makes sense because, I mean, a lot of these folks are doing, a lot of manual labor, blue collar type of stuff. And there's birth rate implications down the way. If I were to just look at the population as a whole, it's slightly younger than what you see at a national level. Around 30% of the population is over the age of 55 now. So, yeah, the silver tsunami is real. Boise, as a whole, for the metro, has better looking, just relatively better looking demographics, but heading in the wrong direction, right? So, this is what Ada County looks like. This is the most populous county in the metro. More of the same. So most of the individuals in Boise, it's concentrated with Hispanic or Latino individuals in Canyon, which I believe is the second most populous county. Now, understand what I'm doing is I'm just showing the population by really age and race. What if you were to just try and capture really why the population is changing? So, for example, is it people moving right from a county over, from a state over, or maybe from outside of the country, which is what we pretty much saw at a national level in 2024? All of the net migration was international. So net migration breaks down into domestic and international, right, migration. It was all international. Very rare to see that. Okay. In Boise, it's not necessarily that trend, although it's part of the trend. There has been some domestic migration into this market, and a good bit of folks are moving here from out of state. Most of the when you look at like mobility measures, a lot of the times, if I'm just kind of going there, since it's in kind of the ballpark, uh, it's usually people like either moving within a county, say like upgrading to another place, or maybe they're moving like within the state, but out of state it is it usually a smaller piece of the pie. But that is definitely occurring here, and it doesn't surprise me at all. I think this market's had a good bit of California folks move in. That's not a new theme, really. I mean, Nashville has seen that, but really on a net basis, especially Davidson County, it's actually all international migration outside of natural change that's driving the population. So, with that said, there's a lot of downstream implications for something like that because it's going to flow through the household data. Typically, what you see if the population is younger, we're not talking about unpaid balance or anything like that. Usually, a larger share of homeowners have mortgages. So nationally, that figure is around 40%. Homeowners are mortgage free. It's like closer to, I want to say, 34%, but we'll look at it here in a second. While we're at it, I mean, I guess we can look at the NMDB data for Boise. This is just kind of like tracking delinquencies and things like that. For this like kind of FHA kind of bucket, it's clearly back to the pre-COVID trend. And with all the moratoriums rolling off, I mean, that kind of only makes sense. I suspect it'll get even worse. For all mortgage markets, I mean, again, back to the pre-COVID trend. Here's enterprise, so conventional. This thing is just kind of there's been so much hand holding, and it's unfortunate. But anyway, I guess we can look at DTIs too while we're here. All right, that's what it is. It's clearly we've just round tripped. 20 years we round tripped. So I will hear people say something to the effect of, well, there's a housing shortage, again, which they can't define, and that's the reason prices are high. Or they'll say something to the effect of, well, incomes can actually catch up to the cost of living like they did in the 70s and 80s. That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard in my life, and here's why. We've had dual income households for decades, and more to the point, we are a growing non family household country. Those households tend to be smaller in physical size. It's oftentimes one person living alone. That puts a natural ceiling on income growth. Do you understand that? Where is the like additional person in your household? Are they just going to like somehow magically appear and start producing a second income? This is so stupid. So look, housing is just all we're doing is propping up the wealth effect at the expense of everything at this point, including capitalism. We don't have things broke a long time ago. This is why I constantly show this chart of housing units per capita and the average household size together, because basically what you saw, back in the 70s and all that stuff, there was a lot of stuff going on, right? We got the gold standard, CMS 1965, no fault divorce goes mainstream, 69, 70, around then. Women joined the workforce. All of that created this stagflationary environment, and there's just a lot going on where you could have high prices, high unemployment. We don't have that backdrop anymore. I don't know how many times that needs to be said. Unless everybody's dog goes viral on the socials, it's prices have to come down. It's not the income and let me say something else. Just use some common sense. If the labor market is weakening as it is now, and we'll get to that here in a second, but if it's weakening, did you suddenly go to your boss and say, hey, I want like a 15% raise? No, you don't. A dumbass would do that. And that would be kind of entertaining. Anyway, moving on. Okay. What we're looking at here is a bunch of cuts of the household data. Households in general, I think, are easily the most misunderstood concept when it comes to not only the housing market, but just making sense of the direction of inflation and or why our current administration, I'm not political, I'm just looking at this thing from a mass standpoint, are doing all this crazy shisty shit. They're just trying to prop up the wealth effect because there's a lot of individuals, not the uber wealthy, who a lot of their nest egg is in their house. So I am sympathetic to that, but to a point, because we're trying to thread a needle where there's no math that really supports that. So, okay, without further ado, again, I'll explain this color scheme. It looks busy. It's all connected in some way. I'm going to start out with this chart in the top left-hand corner. This is what I commonly refer to as the housing stock. Okay, now, I'm not talking about, when people talk about the housing stock, sometimes they're talking about permitting. No, I'm talking about the the total number of homes in an area, not what's just for sale or what's for rent, what's not for rent, what's not for sale, what's not even occupied, which would be vacant. So in Ada County, and we're looking at the 1 year ACS annual estimates of this data from 2005 to 2024. Again, it doesn't exist right for 2020 because of COVID, and that information was not made available because of some, it wasn't statistically reliable. Everything else really from this single chart, minus these two, is just kind of an iteration of this. So stuff that has a blue background, think owner occupied, blue, 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 red, renter occupied, blue, I mean red, 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 red. So let me explain kind of back to this idea that households can only get so small in size. That's why I show that chart of housing units per capita being range bound, but in a slight sort of tilt up. But then also the average household size has clearly kind of slowed its decline because households can only get right so small in size because, right, again, back to this idea, you're stretching fewer incomes across these homes. People have this idea that we're just going to build and build and build and build. The only reason these guys want to build is because they need a job, and I get that, and I'm sympathetic to it, but these guys are so drunk on all this free money, it's fucking stupid. So, okay, let me explain some things that you see across renters versus homeowners and how it's all connected in terms of size, age, family, non-family. Renters tend to be biased to young people. Renter households tend to be smaller in size. Renter households are more concentrated with non-family households. Non-family households are oftentimes one person living alone. Uh, on the renter side of the equation, think about like a young professional, say they're renting their apartment, okay, and they live alone, live in the bachelor lifestyle. On the flip side, on the home ownership side, that could be like an old widower, mortgage free, living alone, like an old lady. Okay, so it's not, non families are not just uh, a function of renter households. You see it right on the home ownership side too. More concentrated amongst renters, it's around 50% of them. For homeowners, it's, I want to say, like closer to around 28-ish%, 30-ish%. But they're growing as a share of households. Part of that, right, is due to old age. Part of that's due to delayed major life decisions, like people forming families, like young individuals. Uh, the other thing pushing the average household size down secularly is, right, kind of back to this idea of delayed family formation, is declining birth rates. So once you factor all of those things in and you normalize for it, you realize there is objectively no structural housing shortage. And I'm not saying that things won't need to be replaced over time, like the actual housing stock. Of course it will. I'm not saying that construction is not needed, you know, going forward at all. That's stupid. What I'm saying is, to the degree that it exists right now, it is insanely frothy. It just is. So, okay, I know there's like some legends and stuff cut off, but I'm just going to kind of focus on renters here first, and I'm going to cut these households by just how they experience shelter costs. So rents to incomes. So at a national level, again, back to this right yellow dotted line, everything here is meant to sort of draw your attention to where the issue is. At a national level, around 50% of households are cost burden, meaning they pay 30% plus of their monthly income towards rent. So as a share of renters, okay, here it's higher than that, and it's been that way for 3 years. And the last time it was this concentrated was in 2010. So the way to read this is obviously the darker the shading, the worse home or renter affordability is. And these renters are very small in size in terms of headcount. That's a really low number. I've seen it lower in markets. So the way that this reads is around 27% of all renter households, or just over 17,000 of them, pay 50% plus of their monthly income towards rent. That's bad. That's really bad. And that's biased to youth, right? These boomers, they need to quit talking about whether or not this is an issue. And especially, you see how this 50% plus starts to really eat into, right, when the labor market's very weak. It all moves together. And now it's just really made its way, I mean, into some of these areas too. It's just not great. Now, okay, let's go look at mortgage households. And this is why everything is always about details. That's just kind of, I've never had an experience where everything was just like straightforward. Well, that's not true, but most of the time it's just not. Okay, up here, this is all homeowners, but I'm just breaking it out with and without mortgages. With is this blue, gray, think silver tsunami. That's going to be biased to old people. If you bought a home a long time ago, the chances that you're going to be cost burdened is virtually nil. So the people who have mortgages, they're going to be the ones, if anybody, who's struggling with affordability. But we need to figure out how concentrated it is. At a national level, this concentration is around 30% of mortgage households. Here, it's a little bit less than that. We'll call it like 27%-ish, give or take. But you can see, really, we've been in no man's land in terms of affordability since, we'll call it, I don't know, 2014, 2012-ish. It's moving in the wrong direction. But at the same time, right, there's a growing share of mortgage-free households. Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so this figure is around, I think I said, 34%. Nationally, it's around 40%. If I just look at the entire pie, with and without mortgages, okay, bring that down a little bit more. In terms of the number of households paying X percent of their monthly income towards housing. So on the one hand, you have near term a growing share of very cost burdened homes, right? We're talking about 30% plus, and some really on this higher end, not great. But there's gray bleeding into it, meaning that there's a growing share of households that are mortgage free, and this doesn't necessarily apply to them. If I were to show this chart like this, what I just said would make a whole heck of a lot more sense. But that should be pretty intuitive. And again, that's going to be primarily old people. Not all old people. I mean, you do always have scenarios where there's just younger people who make good incomes. That's true here in pockets. And we have seen some people, at least in the margin, come in and pay cash. These individuals tend to be, I would say, on the higher or the older end of the prime working age, maybe a little bit above that. And I suspect, as with many markets, you're just having a lot of people come in here, and they're either trying to claim, right, Boise as their primary residence due to something like the home ownership exemption, and just kind of arbitrage things. And then just on top of that, investors. So, okay. Now this visual down here is really kind of what will explain really kind of what's going on here. Uh, Specifically, who is moving to the area. What this visual does, okay, remember blue background, so we're looking at homeowners. We're not making a distinction for like how much they're paying towards home ownership costs or anything like that. If they have a mortgage, nothing. We're just kind of looking at the physical features of right these homeowners. And all this is, it is cutting the household data owner occupied by family F and non-family NF. So family is this green, pink, and blue shading. Non-family is yellow, gray. And the darker respective shading, just like with most of my things, is just kind of trying to draw, or just like the respective shading is trying to draw your attention to certain things. If you see a market like where there's a lot of young, say, non-family households being formed and they're living alone, that's an obvious pressure point because young people just make less money. You see that literally in every single market. So, and that would only make sense because non-families, again, biased to smaller in physical size, then their income is going to be lower, right? I mean, the income, and this is across all households here, and this is on an inflation adjusted basis for Ada County is higher than the national average. If you were to look at that by family and non-family, then it would become abundantly clear what's going on. But I mean, look, on the home ownership side, this is still right a little bit more concentrated of a family market than you see across the country. If I were to take this back further and look at these trends, and it does exist, I'm just not showing it, you would see that this market, just like every other market, is becoming more of a non-family market. It just isn't just totally falling apart in that direction. Uh, Basically, you had, and we'll show this year over year. 2022, there was a lot of non-family, right, that came in, not living alone, but then a good chunk of that was living alone. 23 was more of a scenario of families, right? So female, no SP, that means no spouse present. So think like a divorcee, kids living with them, or like maybe your parent is living with you, whatever. A family has a minimum size of 2 people, right? We got to know our definitions. Does that make sense? So 2024 was also a good bit of non-family on the home ownership side. That's pretty unusual if you look at that across markets. So on the renter side, it's actually more concentrated than the national average with non-family, and it has been really since about 2015. That is a problem because again, they're biased to being younger. So let me make one more point here. This chart, notice how at 23 to 24, it was a lot of non-family. That's why average household size keeps going down for homeowners. Right there. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. Right here, that was less of a thing from 23 to 24. I mean, it makes sense when you had all this non-family come in 22 to 23 for it to go down, but now it's moving higher. So that typically, when you see it moving higher, and not always the case, but that is a sign of how like household stress. When money is tight, people pull the resources to pay for things like housing. What that eventually does is it causes the average household size to move meaningfully higher. All things equal, right? I mean, there's a secular component to that, so that's why you have to look into these iterations to make sense of it all. But that's what's going on. And the other thing too, I mean, like I'm looking at the household income data up here. You can actually look at it by like the source of somebody's income. So is it wages and salaries, social security, retirement income, all that. Place like this, if the population is younger, they're less likely to be self-employed. In other words, they're getting more of their income from wages and salaries. And from you started to see a drop off between 23 and 24 in this market, which is consistent. Even though the unemployment rate is still low, it's in a a slow sort of move higher uptrend, that's consistent with a softening labor market. So spending equals jobs. Spending equals jobs. If people lose their jobs, they can't spend. Prices come down. Should be somewhat intuitive. All right, moving on to the labor data. This is what that information looks like for the state of Idaho. This visual again appears busy. It's not. All I'm doing is I'm showing the data a variety of different ways so you can just see it in detail. But this visual incorporates both the establishment survey and the household survey. So CES, that's the establishment survey. That's this chart, this chart, this chart. NFP, think non-farm payrolls, think establishment survey. That's the number that gets quoted month over month, seasonally adjusted. Hey, we added this many jobs for whatever month it is. That is an employer-facing survey. It captures where the employer is located, but most people live in the vicinity of where they work. Depends on the industry. They may not live like in the county in which their employer is located, but in general, the vicinity. That's true even in this market. Now, on the other hand, by the way, that survey, it doesn't make a distinction for multiple job holders, part-time, full-time. It doesn't capture the unincorporated self-employed, all that sort of stuff. But the household survey does. That's what produces the unemployment rate. And at a state level, it also produces these two metrics as well. So, right, the point of this setup is to basically show that when job growth slows, the unemployment rate moves higher. It is, broadly speaking, but in a very sort of slow way. So goes down, unemployment rate goes up. Pretty self-explanatory. Now you can even view this right as a stacked bar chart again. And the advantage of this is because that's only a line. I didn't really tell. I mean, I know it's going down as of now. It's still positive, but it's moving down. But this is everything that rolls up into NFP. So government plus the private sector, which is everything else, is NFP. Okay, so what's unusual about Idaho, and this is true in even Boise, I'll show it in a second, a lot of construction, a lot of leisure and hospitality. I pulled the QCEW data for this. This is through November. These are those more timely sample estimates. This appears to be overstated. It's not falling off a cliff, but it does appear to be overstated. Construction is being driven primarily by a lot of this commercial stuff. When you look at, obviously, that at a local level and in a place like Boise. So, but the advantage of this is, okay, I'm thinking head count when I'm looking at this rather than just a rate of change. You could do that too if you wanted to put everything in the same level playing field. But a lot of trade, transportation, and utility jobs, notice how that's negative year over year. Pretty typical of a recession. There's very lopsided job growth. Okay, while I'm here, I'm going to explain something. So, notice the difference here in the employment population ratio and the labor force participation rate. Notice how it behaved in GFC where they diverged. The employment population ratio fell faster than the labor force participation rate. But now they're both going down sort of in unison. Okay, if you just think about how those metrics are calculated, because it's not calculated the same way as the unemployment rate is, because that's a very narrow measure in terms of perceived demand for employment. Have you looked for a job in the past 4 weeks? Really? That's it? There's more to it than that. But if you just kind of strip that out and set that aside, basically what happens, and this is the mechanical nature of the unemployment rate. This is why I always say people have an unhealthy obsession with that thing. It's due to these labor force flows. This is happening primarily because people are going from employed to not in the labor force from 1 month to the next. That's what's happening. Okay. And there's a variety of plausible reasons for that. There's a bunch of research around it, but that's what appears to be happening when you assess those labor force flows. If people go from suddenly employed to unemployed, then you could easily see U3 or the unemployment rate move higher. This is really stupid. It's just mechanical. This, if you don't know how this is calculated, then it's meaningless, and it's certainly not going to tell you where we go from here. Okay, sorry, I'm done ranting. Whoops, should have updated this. Everything here, minus the unemployment rate, is through November. This has kind of like a wonky release schedule. That doesn't come out until the 16th, but everything else is. So this is obviously the larger DC metropolitan area, not just DC proper. Okay, Boise. Let's see what we got here. Okay. Right. Non-farm payrolls continues to slow. It's not collapsing by any stretch. Again, this is overstated. Trade, transportation, utilities, government down. There's some healthcare in here too. So again, when people lose their jobs, they can't spend. This is that much more relevant to a younger population. You have to factor that in too, because they draw more of their income from wages and salaries. People should talk about that more, but they just don't. Okay, one more thing. I'll go look at let's see, some rents. And I'll talk about some other things along the way. So this is what multifamily rents look like for the metro of Boise. Year over year up top, the actual number on the left-hand y-axis, and the rent vacancy rate on the right-hand y-axis. Basically just letting you know that, when the rent vacancy rate falls, in theory, at least in this crazy post-QE world, that's going to drive rent prices higher. You obviously saw vacancy spike there. Now they're kind of moved down a little bit. And then here it is for the city of Boise. More of the same. But again, this comes from Apartment List. It's through December of 25. And as you can see, this is just a giant can kicking exercise. It's now on the verge of rolling back over again. Really, really stupid. Okay, but that's only part of the equation. And here's the thing, and I think this is really, really important for this market. From a structural standpoint, I'm not talking about what's being built. I'm talking about all of these renter-occupied homes, the accumulation, the cumulative number. How many actually exist in a place like Boise? This market, again, relatively high home ownership rate, especially in Ada and like Canyon County, but within the renters, it's very concentrated with single family. So it's around 50% for those two counties, and that accounts for the bulk of the population in that metro. So do you see how, just from a materiality standpoint, it really does make a lot of sense to pay attention for single family rents? This is from Zillow. This is their single family asking rents, right? And this is across the entire MSA. It's only through November. That's the most recent stuff. But yeah, I mean, yes, they built a lot of multifamily out there. I, in fact, posted about that on Substack today. I was really talking about the national jobs report, but I did mention Boise specifically because it does relate to construction and the fact that a lot of jobs in that market are related to all this Micron chip plant stuff. Of course, there's all these real estate speculators chasing that. There's been a lot of multifamily, but from a structural standpoint, there's still a lot of single family, especially on the renter side. That's just very high, right? I mean, that figure, 50% in that market, and especially those two counties versus like, what is it, 30-ish% at a national level, that's pretty concentrated. Yeah. Anyway, let's see. We didn't look at permits, but again, you can go find that. I literally posted that information for even the city of Boise. I didn't show any of the real estate data for that market. You can go find that on the website for the metro. It's all that stuff is for free. It's for every single metro. It's configured in a way that'll allow you to get through it very quickly. But there's no housing shortage here. Incomes are not going to catch up. It's going to have to be the price that comes down. I will be very interested to see what happens when we start to see all this commercial construction stuff drop off. and the AI bubble burst, because as you clearly saw within the DTIs and all that stuff, it's very unaffordable out there. A lot of investor activity. That's an everywhere problem. Money has to find and chase a yield wherever it can. So anyway, guys, I hope that was helpful. Yeah, if you like this sort of stuff, I'd be maybe I may entertain doing it for some other areas, but I'm kind of boring, and this is technical stuff too, so I understand that. Okay, have a good one.